He rejected the beautiful sister and chose the one no cowboy wanted. The saloon windows glowed warm against the cold frontier night, and the sound of fiddles carried into the street where Luke Callahan stood with his hat pulled low. He wasn't the kind of man who lingered in towns often, but tonight, whispers had chased him there. Word had traveled fast about two sisters, one a striking beauty who had caught the eye of nearly every man within 100 miles, and the other a quiet shadow, always standing at her sister's side, her presence almost forgotten. Inside, men laughed too loud, glasses clinked, and talk circled like smoke around the beautiful sister, Clara. She was the woman every cowboy claimed he'd take for his wife if given half a chance. Golden hair, a smile that made ranch hands stammer, and a way of carrying herself that promised warmth and charm. When Luke pushed open the saloon doors, all eyes turned to see if he would be another man to join that circle, another fool to lose himself in her shine. But Luke's gaze passed over Clara with the ease of a man who had seen beauty before and knew how quickly it could turn hollow. His eyes stopped instead on the sister standing in the corner, her hands folded tight, her dark dress plain and dust-worn, her face marked not by softness but by a steady resilience that spoke of work and hardship. Mary, the sister no cowboy wanted. They called her too quiet, too ordinary, too scarred by a life of toil to be worth notice. Luke studied her a moment longer. There was no artifice in her, no carefully crafted smile meant to win him over. She met his eyes not with practiced flirtation, but with the kind of honesty that made him straighten his shoulders. He knew in that instant what most men never bothered to see. She carried her beauty deep, like a hidden flame that only those with patience and grit could find. When Clara swept toward him, laughing as though victory was already hers, Luke removed his hat politely but stepped past her without a word. The room grew still. Her laughter faltered, then hardened into disbelief as he stopped in front of Mary. He didn't ask for a dance or offer some careless compliment. He simply said her name, quiet and steady, as though it was already a vow. Mary blinked in surprise, her breath caught in her throat. Men around them shifted, muttering in confusion. Why would he choose her, when Clara stood in her silken dress like the prize every man dreamed of? But Luke had lived long enough on lonely trails and under open skies to know that what shines brightest often fades quickest. He wasn't looking for a fleeting light, he was searching for a fire that could endure the coldest nights. In the days that followed, tongues wagged cruelly. Clara's friends whispered that Mary had trapped him, that Luke would tire of her and turn back. But Luke's resolve only grew stronger. He rode alongside Mary as she carried water from the well, fixed fences beside her when the wind tore them down, and listened to her quiet words at dusk when the world was too tired for vanity. In her silence, he found steadiness. In her scars, he found truth. Clara tried once more, cornering Luke with a smile sharpened by pride, asking if he realized what he was giving up. Luke only answered with the calm certainty of a man who had found something rare. I'd rather have the woman who walks with me through dust and storm than the one who shines only when the lamps are lit. Mary's eyes had filled with tears the first time he said it, not because she doubted his words, but because no one had ever seen her for what she truly was. And when Luke finally reached for her hand, the weight of every rejection she had endured seemed to lift in an instant. She wasn't the sister every cowboy wanted. She was the one who had been overlooked, cast aside, and underestimated. Yet she was the one he chose, and in that choice, Luke knew he had found not just a partner but the strongest kind of beauty, the kind that never faded. The frontier town of Dry Creek was the kind of place where the wind carried both dust and gossip. Men worked hard under the merciless sun, women kept their families alive with grit and prayer, and every soul who lived there knew that appearances mattered nearly as much as survival. It was a town that noticed beauty, praised it, envied it, and tore it apart. And in that town lived two sisters who were as different as dusk and dawn. Clara was the one they called beautiful. She had hair like spun gold, eyes that sparkled like the creek after rain, and a smile that could stir up trouble without her even meaning to. When she walked down the street in her fine dresses, men tipped their hats, and women watched with tight jaws and whispered to each other. Clara had no shortage of suitors. Ranchers, drifters, shopkeepers, even the banker's son had all vied for her attention. Beside her always walked Mary, the plainer sister, the quiet one. She wore darker colors, not because she wanted to fade, but because she had long learned that no one looked at her anyway. Her hands were calloused from work, her figure sturdy from hauling water and chopping wood. Her dark brown hair often escaped its pins, and her face carried the faintest scar along her jaw from a childhood accident with a horse. It wasn't that Mary was unattractive, it was simply that Clara's beauty outshone her so completely that most men never bothered to notice. But Mary wasn't bitter. She loved her sister. She defended her when jealous tongues turned cruel, and she protected her when overzealous men pressed too close. She told herself that her role in life was not to be seen but to be steady. After all, in a place like Dry Creek, not every woman was destined to be admired. Some were destined to endure. It was on a cold evening when Luke Callahan rode into town, the sky bruised with twilight, that everything began to change. Luke was no ordinary drifter. His reputation had traveled farther than he had. Men said he was a rancher who had once held more land than any other in the county, only to lose half of it in a fire that nearly cost him his life. Others said he had fought in battles out west, surviving things no man should see. Whatever the truth, he carried himself like a man who had earned every scar and every silence. Broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun, Luke drew the kind of attention that filled a room without a word. That night, the saloon was alive with music and laughter. Cowboys clapped their hands to the fiddler's tune, boots stomped against the floorboards, and glasses clinked in cheers. Clara was there, of course, shining as brightly as the lamplight. Men circled around her, offering compliments, fighting for her attention. And she, with the ease of a practiced beauty, laughed and teased and let them hope. Mary sat in the corner, a glass of water untouched before her, watching with the same quiet patience she always had. She didn't resent Clara. She simply observed, ready to step in if her sister needed rescuing from too much admiration. When the saloon doors swung open and Luke Callahan walked in, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed, eyes turned. There was something about him that commanded respect without asking for it. He scanned the room once, his expression unreadable, and every man silently wondered who he had come for. Clara noticed first. She straightened, her lips curving into the smile that had undone so many men before. She smoothed her skirts, adjusted her posture, and waited. To her, it was obvious. Why wouldn't this rugged newcomer fall into the same trap every man did? But Luke's gaze didn't linger on her. It slid past Clara as though she were no more than another face in the crowd. Instead, his eyes stopped on Mary. Mary felt the weight of his attention like a jolt. She blinked, uncertain, then quickly lowered her gaze, sure she had imagined it. Men didn't look at her that way. They didn't look at her at all. Yet Luke walked forward, ignoring the rustle of whispers that followed him, and stopped in front of her table. He removed his hat, his voice low but steady as he spoke. Evening, Mary. He knew her name. That alone left her breathless. Clara's laughter faltered. The men around her glanced at each other in confusion. Why Mary? Of all women. Mary swallowed hard, forcing her voice to work. Good evening, Mr. Callahan. He studied her face a long moment, his gaze steady, not searching for beauty but seeing something else. Then he gave the faintest nod, as though he had found what he'd been looking for. Without asking for permission, he took the empty chair beside her and sat. The saloon buzzed with shocked whispers. Clara's cheeks flushed with heat, her pride wounded. She excused herself from her circle and approached, laying a hand on Luke's arm with a smile that was suddenly brittle. Mr. Callahan, she said sweetly. I don't believe we've met. I'm Clara. Luke glanced at her, polite but brief, before turning back to Mary. Yes, I know. His voice was firm, final. Mary's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. The room felt heavy, every eye on her, waiting for her to stumble or shrink. But Luke's presence beside her steadied her in a way she couldn't explain. The days that followed only deepened the confusion in Dry Creek. Luke didn't court Clara. He didn't bring her flowers or linger outside her window. Instead, he sought out Mary. He walked with her when she went to the market, carried her buckets when she fetched water, and spoke to her in the quiet tones of a man who valued listening more than boasting. Clara tried to laugh it off, saying Luke would soon come to his senses. Her friends whispered crueler things, claiming Mary must have tricked him or bewitched him somehow. But Luke didn't falter. Each time Mary looked into his eyes, she saw no hesitation, only certainty. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie gold, Mary finally asked the question that burned inside her. They were fixing a section of fence near the Callahan Ranch, Luke's hand steady on the posts while Mary held the rails. "Why me?" she asked softly, not looking at him. "Why not Clara? She's everything a man could want." Luke straightened, brushing the dust from his hands. He regarded her with quiet intensity. "Because I don't need everything a man could want. I need one thing a man can't live without. And I see it in you." Mary's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that. She felt the sting of tears and quickly turned away, afraid to let him see. But Luke stepped closer, his voice gentler now. "You've spent your life unseen, Mary. I know what that feels like. But I see you, and I'll never stop." She looked at him then, truly looked, and for the first time in her life, she believed.
Dry Creek had never been kind to those who defied its unspoken rules, and Luke Callahan's choice to court Mary instead of Clara rattled the town like a sudden storm. Whispers spread down Main Street, through the church pews, and across every supper table. Men shook their heads, saying Luke had gone blind. Women muttered that he'd regret it soon enough. And Clara, who had never known the sting of being overlooked, simmered with a wounded pride that turned sharp. She didn't lash out at Luke directly. Her pride would not allow it, but Mary bore the brunt of her sister's hurt. At home, Clara's once playful remarks became cutting. "Strange, isn't it?" she'd say with a tight smile, "how men sometimes take pity on the plain ones. I suppose even a rugged cowboy like Luke Callahan wants to feel generous." Mary swallowed the words, burying the pain deep. She refused to fight with her sister. She had lived in Clara's shadow all her life. She wouldn't let bitterness destroy the fragile thing blooming with Luke. Still, every cruel remark left its mark, and some nights she lay awake wondering if the whole town was right, if Luke would one day wake up, realize his mistake, and walk away. But Luke's actions told a different story. He rose before dawn to mend his fences, and more often than not, Mary was beside him. He showed her how to tighten a saddle, how to read the clouds for storms, how to find water when the land seemed dry as bone. He never treated her as fragile or unworthy. He trusted her, leaned on her, and spoke to her as though her opinions mattered. And the more time they spent together, the more Mary felt herself stepping out of the shadow she'd always lived in. The turning point came one Sunday morning. The church bell rang across town, summoning everyone to the small white building that doubled as both sanctuary and schoolhouse. Mary dressed in her plainest blue dress, her hands trembling as she buttoned the collar. She dreaded the stares, the whispers, the inevitable comparisons to Clara, who would arrive in a gown that glimmered like summer sky. When Luke arrived at her door, freshly shaved and dressed in a crisp white shirt, he didn't comment on her dress or her hair. He simply smiled as though she were the only woman in the world. "Ready?" he asked, and so she walked with him down the main road, his hand steady at her back. The townsfolk turned their heads, eyes widening, whispers rising like wind through the prairie grass. "Clara," already standing at the church steps with a gaggle of admirers, stiffened as she saw them. Her smile faltered, her eyes narrowed. Luke didn't flinch. At the church doors, he did something no man in Dry Creek had ever dared. He took Mary's hand openly, lacing his fingers through hers, and led her inside. It was a small act, but to Mary it felt like the world itself had shifted. For once, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the unwanted sister. She was chosen, and chosen without shame. Clara's anger burned hot after that. She confronted Mary in their small shared room that night, her voice sharp as broken glass. "How could you? You know I've had my eye on him since the day he rode into town." Mary steadied her breath, refusing to wilt. "You've had every man's eye, Clara. Every man's heart. But Luke isn't a prize to be claimed. He's a man who sees what he wants, and he chose me." Clara's cheeks flushed scarlet, her hands clenching at her sides. "Then you'd better hope he never regrets it." The words hung heavy between them, but Mary found she no longer feared them. For the first time in her life, she had something stronger than Clara's disapproval. She had Luke's faith. Life wasn't suddenly easy. The ranch was demanding. Storms ripped through fences, and winters bit hard. Mary bore it all, standing shoulder to shoulder with Luke. They laughed in the evenings by the fire, shared quiet prayers at dawn, and held on through every hardship. With each passing season, Mary felt her doubts weaken and her strength grow. The town, however, wasn't so quick to change. Some neighbors warmed to Mary, surprised by her steady kindness and work ethic. Others clung to their judgment, muttering that Luke could have done better. Mary heard the whispers when she walked through town, but they no longer cut her the way they once had. She had Luke's hand in hers, and that was enough. One evening, as summer faded into autumn, Luke returned from the fields to find Mary waiting on the porch, her face pale but her eyes bright. She took his hand and pressed it to her belly. "Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we're going to have a child." For a moment, silence filled the air between them. Then Luke's face broke into a smile wider and warmer than Mary had ever seen. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close, his voice rough with emotion. "Mary Callahan," he said, "you've given me more than I ever dreamed I'd have." The months that followed tested them in new ways. Pregnancy was not easy on Mary. The work became harder, the days longer, and the whispers crueler. Clara, though softened by time, still struggled to mask her jealousy. Yet through it all, Luke remained steadfast, never wavering, never once allowing Mary to feel unwanted. He built a cradle with his own hands, carved with care, and painted the walls of the nursery in gentle hues. When their son was born on a stormy spring night, Luke held him close, his rugged hands trembling as tears filled his eyes. He looked at Mary, exhausted but radiant, and whispered, "He's got your strength." And Mary, gazing at the child nestled between them, felt something she had never known before: peace. The world might never understand why Luke had chosen her, but she no longer needed it to. She had a husband who saw her worth, a child who would grow in love, and a life built not on fleeting beauty but on something far stronger. Clara stood at the edge of the room that night, silent, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Mary thought she saw something softer in her sister's eyes, not jealousy, but perhaps understanding. Maybe even regret. Clara left without a word, and though she would always struggle with her pride, she never again mocked Mary's place beside Luke. Years rolled by, and the ranch flourished. Luke and Mary raised their children with grit and tenderness, teaching them to value truth over appearances, endurance over charm. The town slowly shifted its tune, no longer whispering doubts but telling stories of the quiet woman who had captured the heart of the strongest man they knew. And Mary, once the sister no cowboy wanted, became the heart of the Callahan Ranch, the anchor of a family, the proof that love built on steadfastness burns brighter than beauty ever could. Luke never once looked back at what the town thought he should have chosen. He had chosen Mary, the woman unseen, the woman steady, the woman strong. And for the rest of his days, he thanked God for giving him the wisdom to see what others had overlooked. In their later years, when Luke's hair had silvered and Mary's hands bore the gentle tremor of age, they often sat together on the wide porch of the ranch house, watching the sun sink behind the hills as their children's laughter carried across the fields and their grandchildren ran wild in the tall grass. Clara visited sometimes, quieter now, softened by life's lessons, and even she would admit with a wistful smile that Luke had seen something no one else had. And as Luke held Mary's hand, the lines of their lives written into their skin, he would still look at her the way he had that first night in the saloon, not as the sister no cowboy wanted, but as the only woman he had ever truly needed.